Well, generally, all your main facts have to be attributed to some source. I usually use the two-source rule. That if I find information from somebody that nobody else has given me, I try to find a second source to basically tell me that information independently. And so I have to be sure that that source hasn't learned that information from the first source that I spoke to, that there isn't a connection. So it is this whole evidence and investigative process. And the other thing is you evaluate your sources. Why is this person telling me this? What is their motivation? What are they getting out of it? Why did they want me to know this information? So each source has to be evaluated. And yes, the journalist's judgment is important here. When you reach an investigative level, usually your editors believe that you have good judgment, you have good news judgment, and that you can identify most of the time when a source is not telling you the truth. And that's what makes an investigative journalist in that capacity, as opposed to someone who's starting out.
There's been there's a story in the news now, right, about protection of journalist sources. So what kind of protection is there for your sources?
Well, your sources, depending on what kind of sources they are. If they're on the record, then they're being named in the story. So it's obvious that they're those kind of sources. If they're background sources where they say, I'm giving you this information, but you cannot attribute it to me, you have to go find another source that will say this on the record in order to be able to use this information. So those kind of sources we have to be careful of. I oftentimes keep them in separate notebooks. I sometimes keep them coded. I develop my own coding system for names. When I did human rights investigations and reports on human rights, the names of victims are very important, and even of sources that give you firsthand eyewitness interviews. So it's very important. It's important to keep your sources in a safe place. It's very important to keep their names in a coded system. If you're using it on your computer, to encrypt it, because it's not just being subpoenaed in court to bring out to reveal your sources, but it's also of somebody hacking into your system and getting those source names, and that does happen in very high-profile criminal cases, human rights cases. That does happen, yeah. So it's just about protecting them.
Right. And what about developing sources? Are you always using new sources, or are you developing people that you have sort of a long-term relationship with?
Both. I develop as I go, and I realize this person would be a great source. So I ask them, would I be able to contact you for future stories? Would I be able to contact you as an expert on this topic if it doesn't relate to this case? And I build on those relationships, and I'll contact people from previous stories and say, can you analyze this story for me? Can you give me a hypothetical? Can you give me your take on it? And that's how I build long-term sources. But every source goes in my source book, and I usually make notes of, were they a hostile source? Were they cooperative? What kind of information? So taking notes on remembering what kind of source they were and what kind of information they provided. And then I can also go back to my source book later and say, a year later, did their information hold up? Did it make sense? Because you forget over time when you do so many stories. So keeping a source book, keeping your business card book, but also keeping notes on your sources.
What's going on in investigative reporting now? Are there some new trends, some new trends that are happening now?
Some new trends, let's see. Well, a lot of people, it's not very new, but investigative reporters are starting out in certain places on the web, in social media, and scouring them and finding sources there as well. It's a lot probably easier to put feelers out about certain topics through social media, through browsing other people's sites and finding out if there are certain issues, or putting out our own statements or questions on Facebook or on Twitter and seeing who responds back, of finding the people that have been affected by an issue. I think it's a little bit easier now with the with different types of social media than it was in the past. I mean, before you would have to find, before the internet, you would have to find one person that was affected by that issue and then hope that they could link you to another and hope that they could link you to another. So it was really, it was a long process. But now with the internet, you find a listserv, or you find a group or a community or a Facebook page that looks at a certain issue. And you can quickly find people that have been affected by that organization, by that person, by lies, by corruption, by whatever you're looking for.
Right.
So I think that has really helped investigative journalism. You have to, but what it does also do is it forces the journalist to be able to evaluate their sources even more so, and be even more critical of it, because anyone can post anything on the internet. So you can't take someone's word, just written word on a social media site as yes, they've experienced that. So you do have to do your due diligence and follow up with a phone call, a face-to-face meeting, depending on how extensive your investigative reports are. And you still have to do that very traditional meet and greet and interview and in-face to be able to evaluate if what they're saying is credible.